as I mentioned to you before we started recording, this is a very special episode for me. Obviously, every episode is very special, but this kind of stands out from I guess from how you and your work entered my life, so to speak. So usually it's scientists. I've read their papers as part of my education, as part of my PhD, as part of my work, that kind of stuff. But today, speaking to you, the biography of Vladimir Nabokov. And so I thought I'd briefly tell the kind of slightly random story of how I came to your books and to Nabokov in particular. So I was at this weird moment when I never really read too much. I never read too much as a kid. I think my parents read some stuff with me, but I wasn't a huge reader, I would say. And I certainly didn't read serious, in quotation marks, literature until then, at this weird moment when I was 16. And I grew up in Germany. We watched in German class the film version of The Tin Drum by Günter Grass, which Günter Grass is one, I think at the time he was the most recent German-speaking Nobel Prize winner. The film won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film, so it was this, supposedly very important thing. And I was so embarrassed because I didn't know anything about either. I was I don't know who this guy is. I don't know what the film is. And so I never had that in school. I didn't care about school. But for some reason, I was I was kind of embarrassed for not knowing who these big figures were. Anyway, so that kind of started me on basically reading seriously. I don't think The Tin Drum is the best book to start with, to be honest, but hey, you got to start somewhere. And kind of shortly after that, I was basically skipping school is the best way I can put it. And I couldn't go home because I think my mum would be there. So she didn't want her to know it. So I would often just go to the local bookstore and kind of browse books and just spend an hour there. So I didn't have to be in school. So I was just walking around, and the weird thing maybe about the German book system is you have to sell the books for the price on the back of the book in Germany. You don't have, you can't really discount them unless sometimes under rare circumstances they can do it. And so there was this tiny section where there were discounted books, and there were these 2 bricks of a book that were in there. These 2 books that were, I think, 40 euros each in the original price. And I think that maybe put some people off the 40 euros, but these 2 bricks of books that were, I think, set down to 10 euros each or something like that, called Vladimir Nabokov, The Russian Years, and Vladimir Nabokov, The American Years. And I thought, okay, Nabokov, I've heard that name. I think that's an important writer. I'm not sure. And then I read the back of the book, and I'll try to accurately translate this as I go along now. So the back of the book said, it was a quote by someone I'd never heard of, but the quote was very positive. It said, "I don't know what I should admire more, the kind of blinding richness of detailed facts."
Zimmer.
Yes, Dieter Zimmer. Oh, you know that one? Oh, no, I was on site. Okay. Yeah. So basically, yeah, the back kind of said, this greatly detailed book, whether I should admire more the care and sensitivity you took towards interpreting Nabokov's work or the independence of your judgment and style. I'm sure that you've written not only kind of the defining work of Vladimir Nabokov, but also one of the great writer biographies of the century. And I thought, okay, that's a pretty nice statement. And so I bought the books, and it took me a while to actually start reading them because they're so big and intimidating. But once I did, I kind of through your biography, not exactly fell in love with Nabokov, but I was just deeply fascinated with, especially him as a person, his life and the times and all that kind of stuff. And so, this was 15 years ago or whatever. And so, as I said, it's very exciting today to speak to you because it's a very different kind of influence compared to other people. Maybe briefly, I think you had from what I remember reading somewhere, a slightly more traditional introduction to Nabokov than I did.
Well, I had always been a reader, and I was trying to read Joyce in my... Actually, my parents had a bookstore. My parents left school early at 14 in Northern Ireland in the Depression. So they didn't have an advanced education of any kind, but they knew my curiosity and my desire to read. So they bought a bookstore in order to feed which had a lending library, in order to feed my passion for books. And I happened to to reshelve the books that customers had got out, and I noticed that this novel Lolita was supposed to be a great book and a dirty book, and I was about 12 or 13, so I snuck it home and read it, and it was over my head, really. At that age, we weren't as sophisticated about sexual matters as kids these days are, and but it wasn't until I was in my last year at school, so I was 16, when the Time magazine did a cover story on Nabokov. They did an interview with him, which had the headline, "I've never met a more lonely, more lucid, mad mind than mine." And everything he said in the interview was fascinating. So I went to the local public library to see. They didn't have it was on the occasion of his longest novel, Ada, being published in '69, and I couldn't find that, of course, in our local public library. But I went for his latest available, which was Pale Fire, and I just blissed out on it.
Yeah, I guess Lolita wasn't the kind of naughty book you were hoping for as a 13-year-old.
No, it was very puzzling. I mean, it's doing so many things. I mean, it's doing the sexual thing pretty intensely for one who understands his arcane ways of phrasing things. But for a 12-year-old or 13-year-old trying to grasp that vocabulary and the situations, no, it was far too much for me. And it took me quite a while, in fact, to get back to really. Get to really appreciating Lolita up there with some of his other books that I'd fallen in love with in the meantime.
We'll get more to his works later, but I want to talk about his biography, and go through share kind of some of the fascination that I had whilst reading your books, and that presumably you had whilst researching them.
Yeah.
I thought we could maybe start by to a little bit kind of introduce the family. What kind of family was he born into? I mean, he was born in 1899 in St. Petersburg. What was kind of the environment there that he was born into?
He was born into a very wealthy family, and a very liberal branch of that wealthy family. Not all the collateral members of the family were liberal, but Nabokov's father and mother were. His father was a jurist, a criminologist, an editor of one of the leading Russian daily newspaper in St. Petersburg, and was the leader of the largest party in the first Duma, the first state parliament, in 1905. When the Tsar closed down the Duma, dissolved it, Nabokov's father and others went to Viborg in Finland and signed an appeal calling for general mass resistance to this decree, to get people to stop paying their taxes and to avoid conscription. And for this, he was sent to prison by the Tsar. And then later in 1918, he was trying to set up, he was the head of a commission to set up a constitutional assembly. Lenin didn't like the idea of that at all, so he threw him in prison. So it's a great record to be thrown in prison by both the Tsar and Lenin. So that gives you a sense of how close to history Nabokov's family was. His grandfather was a minister of justice under Alexander II and III, and his parents were fabulously wealthy. His mother's side of the family had owned mines in the Urals, as Nabokov said in his autobiography, 50 servants and no questions asked. That they were extremely wealthy. And Nabokov, when he was about 16, inherited an estate from his uncle that was worth, I've had it said, actually almost a couple of $100 million in today's money. So, yeah. And then he lost it. He lost it the next year because it was just before the revolution.
Yeah, I think this is part of the fascination that I had with Nabokov's life was that in part he had this extremely privileged upbringing. We can maybe also speak a little bit about the languages he learned, basically just growing up through his family and all the different things he did. But I think what I found really fascinating is you have this like extremely privileged kid who then becomes even more privileged when he inherits this, what's it called, the Do you know how to pronounce it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The memorial estate. And if you, it has a Wikipedia entry, and it looks a little bit like it's almost like too on the nose. What it is like, White House on the top of a hill and that kind of stuff, with like a lake in front of it and that kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. And then, but I think with the fascinating thing about Nabokov is that he does lose it all. And I think kind of that contrast between, I think that was super fascinating. But maybe what was young Nabokov like? I mean, so I mentioned languages. How did he end up growing up with 3 languages, and kind of what were some of his hobbies?
Well, the first language he learned to read was English. He had English governesses, and his mother, in fact, who was at least trilingual, perhaps quadrilingual, would read bedtime stories to him from English books. So he didn't learn to read Russian, to read and write Russian until he was about 6. His father was appalled when he found out, and promptly brought in a Russian tutor. But yes, he had a French governess from the time he was about 6, so he was fluent in French by the time he was 7. He also had the best draftsman in St. Petersburg, the kind of Canaletto of St. Petersburg, teaching him as a drawing master. He learnt these languages so well, and he had such a passion for literature, that he says he had read all of Shakespeare in the original, all of Tolstoy, and all of Flaubert by the time he was 13. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's also slightly, like, what kind of kid does that? It's also slightly... Because supposedly he must have started when he was 10 or so, like earlier.
Yes. I mean, he was very precocious. He could multiply large numbers in his head when he was 5, and then he lost that mathematical side of his precocity during an illness when he was 7. And after that, he became interested in butterflies. So it's a very curious phenomenon. Oliver Sacks was very interested in my biography because of things like that. Yes, he had a very... he also was telling himself stories all the time when he was 5, say. He was precocious in a lot of ways. But, Russia was a very literary culture and still is. So you can go from one subway called Gorky to another called Chekhov to another called Dostoevsky. You don't get that elsewhere.
Yeah, you already mentioned the butterflies a little bit, and I guess we'll get to that kind of occasionally throughout the conversation. What does one do with a hobby of butterflies? How does that manifest itself, and where does that come from?
It seems to have been something that was in the family, and in a lot of noble families, I think, who had German tutors. It seemed to be Germans that were particularly likely to be butterfly collectors, and they passed on the passion to their tutees. And Nabokov's father collected butterflies. His mother collected mushrooms, which again it's a very, very Russian thing to do. He just fell in love with this first swallowtail butterfly when he was 7, and it became a passion very, very quickly. And by the time he was 8, I think 8 or 9, he had mastered all the butterflies of Europe, and by 10 he had mastered the butterflies of the world. So, yeah, he got and he tried to publish his first article on butterflies at the age of 12.
Yeah, it just occurred to me that I had a slightly different interest in butterflies as a child. I remember when I was, I think, 4 or 5. I liked butterflies, but I liked caterpillars more. And I knew that you could get butterflies come from caterpillars. So I figured if you put a butterfly into a cocoon, it would turn into a caterpillar. So I think I just murdered lots of butterflies in my attempt to get caterpillars by just putting them into like tubes or something like that. And yeah, I'm very sorry. Anyway. So I mentioned literature and butterflies. I think the last one of the main, I think he was interested also in sports, right? But I think one of the other kind of slightly unusual interests he had was chess. So maybe, yeah, how did those two enter his life?
Again, chess is a very Russian passion. He was interested in chess problems. He would relax from composing a fiendishly difficult novel by composing chess problems, and he was a world-class chess problem composer. He represented the US in this, and some of his, I think Boris Spassky commented favorably on one of his chess problems. So he was a good chess player. He wasn't a great chess player. He was more interested in trying to create something intricate and complicated and novel and poetic in the chess problem composition line. And maybe he was trying, I don't know, my knowledge of chess is almost zilch. So I don't know whether he was a bit like that over the chessboard, that he was trying to do things that were too complicated. So he preferred the element of time to drop out of it so that he could compose in his own free time and have multi-layered chess problems with false clues. And yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I just remembered that I think Magnus Carlsen said he doesn't like chess problems. So that maybe there's a slight difference between playing chess and solving chess problems or coming up with them. But yeah, I also don't know much about chess. Okay, so kind of moving forwards a little bit in his life. So we have this precocious young child who speaks multiple languages, very interested in literature and all sorts of other things. Yeah, from a privileged position becomes even more privileged, and then suddenly everything changed. So maybe for context, a little bit, why did everything change? What was the revolution in Russia? And what did Nabokov's family then do in response to that?
There was first a kind of public, popular revolt in February 1917, which led to the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. And Nabokov's father, again, had a key role in this. He actually drafted the abdication manifesto of the Tsar, and he became chancellor of the provisional government, not the first provisional government. There was a series of provisional governments that were set up during 1917 that collapsed one after the other, and he was in one that began about June 1917. And then Lenin was allowed back into Russia from Switzerland and instigated the Bolshevik coup in October or November, depending on which calendar you're using. And at that point, there was a lot of shooting in the streets of St. Petersburg. Nabokov's father was fearful that his sons would get conscripted into the Red Army, so he sent them down to the Crimea. And then the rest of the family followed about a few days later. But in the meantime, he had been imprisoned by Lenin, and by some fluke managed to be released from prison and made his own way to the Crimea, where there was a local government set up, and he was Minister of Justice in that government. So, and that there was a wave of different occupiers of the Crimean Peninsula in those months between November 1917 and April 1919, when the Nabokovs finally managed to escape as the whole peninsula was falling into communist hands. There was machine guns strafing along the water as they sailed out of Sevastopol. So, yes, his father was Minister of Justice, of Minimal Justice, he used to say, because things were so chaotic. And the White Army, there were massacres on both sides. It was, 800 people shot. Of the White Army shot by the Reds off Yalta Pier, they were in Yalta. Nabokov wrote a poem about that, which I managed to smuggle out of what was still the Soviet Union in 82. So they got out of Russia with almost nothing, with a pearl necklace that had been hidden in some talcum powder that a servant had thought to supply them with. So that was about all that they lived on when they got to London, where Nabokov's father's brother was the Russian consul. Nabokov's father then helped set up a Russian liberal newspaper. There was something in London first, but then as the center of the Russian immigration moved to Berlin during the course of 1920, really, as inflation hit Berlin and became rather cheap for those who didn't have Deutschmark to move there. So at one stage, there were 400,000 or 500,000 Russian refugees in Berlin, and 200 Russian language presses in Berlin in about 1923-24, when there was a paper shortage in Russia, and so they were sending material back to the nascent Soviet Union.
to some extent, not all that surprising. Maybe someone who grew up in a very kind of culturally elite family and who spoke English fluently from childhood on. Nabokov then went to Cambridge. So how did that happen? Kind of why? Yeah, what was he doing there?
The idea had been that he would go to Oxford or Cambridge anyway, even if there hadn't been a revolution. He asked about Oxford versus Cambridge and was told that Cambridge was stronger for the sciences. And he was, because of his interest in lepidoptery, in butterflies, he decided to go to Cambridge rather than Oxford. And he did study ichthyology, fish for a term, but wasn't diligent enough. And he decided it was actually easier to focus on Russian and French literature, which of course, he knew better than almost anybody there. So, those were his subjects. He was a very... He had lots of interests other than the studies, shall we put it that way. He was much more interested in composing poetry. He translated Alice in Wonderland into Russian. He translated Romain Rolland's Colas Brignon into Russian. He pursued endless women, as he had been doing since he was 16. And he was a mad keen sportsman. So he was a compulsive goalkeeper in soccer, and also a keen boxer and tennis player. So, his studies came...
it's funny. There seems to be quite a few goalkeepers in literature, right? Wasn't Camus also a goalkeeper? I think there were a few more. Yeah. Some kind of makes sense, maybe, that the person who stands at the back and observes the game quite a lot and has this like slightly unusual position in football. Somehow it weirdly makes sense. Yeah, I mean, so you already mentioned that he liked writing poems and that kind of stuff. Funny enough, we've been speaking about someone who, will become an author and will start publishing books fairly early on. But we haven't really talked about him writing all that much yet, even though, obviously literature has been a backdrop. So, what were kind of his first writing ambitions, his first published works, and,
He's basically writing a poem a day almost from the time he was about 15 onwards. And because he was so wealthy, he was able to publish his first book when he was 17, a book of fairly conventional love poems for the then love of his life. And then he published another book in 1918 with a classmate. This was already during the turmoil of the Russian Civil War, so there were very, very few copies of it left. He published 2 more books of poetry in 22 and 23, and he was starting to write fiction and plays, verse plays. So he was always pretty prolific. His early work he disparaged later as being very trite and conventional, and it wasn't great stuff, but he matured rapidly, and by about 23, 24, he was writing some very powerful stories. And then his first novel in 1925, when he was 26, just after he got married. And he kept on flooding. He was producing books at a great rate in the Russian emigration, and very quickly he was recognized as the literary star, at least of the younger generation. So the first Russian to get a Nobel Prize was Ivan Bunin, who was in 1933, who was another Russian emigre. But already people were saying in 1929, when his first real masterpiece, the Defense, or the Luzhin Defense, as it's sometimes called these days, was published. When the first installment of that came out, another writer of his generation said that the Russian emigration is saved. She knew that this would never be forgotten. His work would ensure that the whole Russian emigration was remembered. That's a pretty strong response. But of course, his work was, as it got more and more complicated, it got less and less easy to translate. So his first 2 novels appeared in German and earned him money. He didn't get much money from his writings in the emigration. He kept himself going as a language tutor, as a tutor of poetry, as a tennis tutor, as a boxing tutor. So all his skills came in handy. And he briefly earned enough from the from the translation of his second novel, which was strongly German-focused, unlike his first one, which was strongly emigre-focused, even though it was set in Berlin. So he was able to buy a little plot of land, but with a dream of building a house on it. But then the Depression happened, and that didn't happen either. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, yeah, as I mentioned, he lived for a long while in Berlin as part of that kind of Russian emigre culture. Why did he leave again? I mean, what could possibly be a reason for leaving Germany in this 20s and 30s? But kind of, just to kind of briefly span some more of the biographical details. He was in Berlin, and then, what happened?
The woman he married was Vera Nabokov. She was Jewish. His father had been the foremost Gentile champion of Jews in Russia before the revolution. So he had written very strong criticisms of pogroms, and just as a journalist of pogroms and of trials of Jews that were rigged. And his co-editors in Riech, the daily newspaper he edited in Russia before the revolution, and in Ruhl, the one he edited in Berlin in the emigration, were nearly all Jewish, and Nabokov's closest friends were Jewish, but at school and in the emigration. So in 1933, when they were really struggling financially, he and his wife and went to live with her cousin, who was of course also Jewish, in her apartment. And it was in 1936 when Nabokov's father was assassinated by Russian right-wingers in 1922 because they held him responsible for the Russian Revolution. In 1936, Hitler appointed one of these two people, one of the two assassins, who had served his time, as head of Russian emigre affairs in Berlin. And Vera Nabokov said to him, "You've got to get out." And so he went he'd been trying for years to get out of Berlin, but there hadn't been a clear path. He'd been trying to go either to France, where he had a lot of literary contacts, and where the center of the Russian immigration had moved by then, or to an English-speaking country, England, the States, Canada, South Africa. He tried them all and didn't get anywhere. But at the beginning of 1937, yes, he left Germany not to return, and was able to, establish a very poverty-stricken existence as a writer in France, where his family joined him in the mid-year in 37. And then they managed to flee France after the tanks had started rolling through France. He'd been trying for ages to get an exit visa, as you needed in those days, and found the bureaucracy needed to be bribed, and he didn't have the money for his passage out. But a Jewish organization helped to fund the family to get to the States. So he arrived in America at the end of May 1940.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit about one thing. I hope I remember this correctly. One thing that I kind of always found interesting is it didn't seem to me as if Nabokov ever really complained about what happened to him, in a sense. I mean, I hope this is not misremembering it, but I remember him as kind of someone. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I mean is, like, you come from this like extreme position, and then you're just like shoved out of your own country, then you go to a different country, then you're kind of pushed out of that country. I think it would be fairly easy to get resentful of a lot of the things that happened to you, but it seemed to me that he didn't quite do that. So I'm curious, kind of a little bit about like kind of what, like personally, how did he deal with all of these things with being in poverty now and fleeing his country and everything?
He thought it was vulgar to complain about the loss of his estates, and the family's wealth. But he was always very, very strongly anti-Soviet because of the repression, the tyranny. He wrote Invitation to a Beheading. In fact, he started writing that in the year that Hitler came to power, and it was it was focused on a kind of futuristic Russia, but it was clearly anti-totalitarian. And then during the Second World War, he wrote a novel called Ben Sinister, which combines elements of Hitler's and Lenin's speeches and treats them as a single ogre, if you like. So he was strongly anti-totalitarian, although he was, unlike his father, he was not really very political. But no, he knuckled down and did what he had to support his family. He undertook translations, the coaching when he couldn't really do coaching once he got to France, which is why they were so poor. You look at photographs of him there, and he's very, very gaunt looking. And then once he got to the US, he was lucky enough to have a few contacts that he could get commissions to write reviews, and he started publishing in the New Yorker poems and stories, and also teaching. He was able to get into the US because a friend of his, a novelist, got offered a job to teach creative writing in Stanford, and felt his English wasn't up to scratch, so he gave the position, as it were, to Nabokov, who did teach at Stanford in his second year in the US, and then had a rather precarious position renewed from year to year in Wellesley College in Boston from 41 to 48. And then he got a position at Cornell, which lasted until Lolita made him so rich that he didn't need to teach anymore. Yes, so he always worked hard. So both writing and teaching, and while he was teaching in Boston, he was also working as a lepidopterist in basically an almost unpaid position. He was curator of Lepidoptera at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, and he was doing research there. And once they got a car, which wasn't until about 47, he never learned to drive. It's funny, his wife did all his typing for him, all his driving for him. She marked all the essays that and exams that he had from his students. She was an ideal support. She did this very voluntarily. He didn't have to ask her. But once they had a car, he would drive around the US and in the summers and collect butterflies and discover new species, which is not the most important thing, but it was something that he'd dreamed about since he was an 8 or 9 year old. He was also doing major revisions of South American butterflies, for instance. So, and this might be of interest. He did a major revision of the blues, the Polyomytene of South America, which he never visited, although he would have loved to, on the basis of very few samples that he was able to collect in wartime conditions from other American institutions. And the people who that work wasn't really paid any attention to until the late 1980s, when new methods of collecting and new methods of DNA analysis and so on, or chromosome analysis first and then DNA, led to new work on it. And the people who worked in that area were also gobsmacked by how brilliantly Nabokov had, and boldly he had revised the genera in these in this family, that they just wanted to pay homage to him all the time by naming new butterflies they discovered after things in Nabokov. So there's a Humbert, a Lolita, a Vera after his wife. I was asked to suggest a name, so I suggested one of my favorite characters, Hazel Shade in Pale Fire, and and it's really astonishing, I mean, just as kind of almost a throwaway remark, he suggested that if we had a Wellesian time machine and we went back to see how the blues, the Polyomytenes, populated America, he hypothesized that there must have been about 5 different waves that came across the Bering Strait. And in 2011, a team at Harvard were able to establish that he was right in all the details, that he suggested 5 different waves and sort of named the periods. And there was nothing. I mean, there was just nobody was doing that kind of analysis of butterflies all that far back. So yes, he worked compulsively 14 hours a day at the lab at Harvard. So it was really hard for him. And that was partly because it was such a trauma for him. This is where he does complain, or he laments it. He tries not to linger on it, but he does express how painful it was for him, having worked so hard to get Russian up to a standard where, as others will say, Russian literary prose has never been so rich as his. He bought a 4-volume dictionary when he was at Cambridge and went through a Russian dictionary and went through it page by page. He had an extraordinary vocabulary, an extraordinary knowledge of Russian literature, and he was using literature in very complex ways in his late Russian fiction. And then he had to give that up, he felt, and start writing in English. And that transition from having developed his instrument for 20 years in Russian and having to start in a way afresh in English, he felt so painful. That was one reason, to avoid facing that pain, he focused instead on butterflies for 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, I actually had a question about the switch from Russian to English, because it's something that I find kind of interesting. So maybe for context, I don't speak Russian, and so all of the works of Nabokov I've read have been either the English original books or the English translations. And I wonder kind of what your opinion is on this, or maybe what the consensus is that obviously you have here also the slight problem that the early works in Russian that I've read in English translation are also, the earlier works and maybe not as refined as later works. But it felt to me that when I initially, after reading your biography, I was like, great, I'm going to read, because I hadn't read any Nabokov, I'm going to read Nabokov now from like beginning to end. And then I started with the early Russian ones in translation, and I felt like something was slightly missing. And I felt like there was something that I didn't quite get or connect with. And then it wasn't until I read Pnin, I hope I pronounced that correctly, which is the first English book of his I read. Suddenly I was like, now I see what he's like. Now it kind of starts to make sense. The kind of the verbal inventiveness and that kind of stuff. And I know he was heavily involved or even translated his own books, but somehow it always felt to me that you have to read him in the original, which is something I generally agree with. But I grew up speaking English and German, right? So I don't like translations in general, once you realize how poor of an approximation any translation is. But I was just curious, like what you think about this like switch from Russian to English and
yeah. I think his English style actually, his late Russian style was very, very rich. It was like Proust in French. The sentences were very convoluted and full of a series of trapdoors or images. Whereas his English style, he managed to pare things down. They're still incredibly lush sentences that he has, but there's a kind of speed and fluidity in the English that I don't think that is there in the Russian. So, and you said that he had a lot of involvement in his translations. He did. But on the other hand, he tended to let somebody else translate rather than to translate them himself, because he would have wanted to rewrite, to let his imagination go in a different direction. So in order to curb that inventiveness, he had somebody else translate, and he would translate the tricky parts, or if there was embedded verse or something like that, puns and so on, he would take care of those, but he would try not to intervene too much. So, I certainly feel that when I look at material from Russian to English, or from English to Russian or German or French, I can see what a loss there is in the translation. He did control his translations into the French, and his wife, whose German was fluent, went with him through the translations into German. It depends on the novel. I think The Defense, which is probably where I would recommend a lot of people should start Nabokov, The Defense or Pnin, is it's not so dependent on language, or I mean, its language is very lush, but its characterization and its story are just so powerful, so heartrending that it carries you over through the slight loss you might have and switch from Russian to whatever language you're reading it in.
Yeah, it's this general thing. I mean, yeah, I basically try not read translations, which obviously limits me to certain languages, but I don't know. For me, it was just like this thing where I had this like real moment with seeing like how bad any good translation is when David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest came out in German. It was like this supposedly great translation that the, guy took like 8 years to translate or something like that. And then it's just a different book. I mean, there's just no other way of putting it. It's just a different book. And this is supposedly one of the best ones out there in German. So it's like, but yeah, that must have been, it seems to me like that must have been quite unpleasant for someone like Nabokov, who has also the linguistic abilities in several languages, to then know that many people are reading his books in basically not the language that he put there.
Yes. On the other hand, he was very pleased to have an international audience by the time Lolita made him famous. Another thing that, of course, was very difficult for him in the transition from Europe to America was the fact that he had this stellar reputation among the Russian immigration, which didn't extend outside the immigration at all. So he had to come into the US as practically an unknown as far as English-speaking readers were concerned, and start again to build up a reputation, which he had even before Lolita, but yes, it really wasn't until, of course, Lolita gave him a reputation that was incomparably greater than any he'd had in the immigration. So it kind of paid off in the end, that switch.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Lolita. And I haven't read all of his stuff, but it also seems, I mean, in some ways there are some similarities to other books. I feel like Nabokov does a lot of, maybe this is just me, but a lot of main characters that are kind of a bit unlikable.
Yes.
But I'm curious, kind of. So we went through his life a little bit, and he's now in the US. He worked for years on the butterflies. Now I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that this is when he's at Cornell. And yes. So what was the motivation? Why did he decide to write a novel about someone who, about this middle-aged man who marries a woman so he can be close to her daughter, sorry. What exactly is what was he trying to do there, and how did that kind of start?
He actually wrote a story, a novella in Russian in 1939. That had the same theme of a man marrying a woman, in this case, a woman who was clearly dying of an illness, in order to have access to her daughter. Interestingly, that one is written in the third person, so it's not from the point of view of the perpetrator. And people didn't like it. I don't like it, actually. So it seems to be so much inferior to Lolita. The idea for it came back to him as something, and I think that there are various things. He wanted to establish himself as an American writer, and I think he saw a connection with Edgar Allan Poe, who married his cousin who was 14, and becomes a kind of talismanic figure for Humbert Humbert, the narrator of Lolita, who's also in literature. He teaches French literature in the US. And also a way of echoing and kind of parodying, if you like, or picking up a lot of themes in Poe, and picking up also themes in Henry James, whom he hated. He loved Poe as a child, but he never got to like Henry James. And Henry James is What Maisie Knew, which is about a young girl's misunderstanding of the relationships between her parents, who are both philandering in both directions. So there were these literary challenges, but I think it was also a kind of thematic challenge. he was a very romantic man, and he fell very heavily in love with a lot of women in his early days until he met Vera. And his books are often full of very strong romance elements. I mean, often treated very unromantically, but love was so important for him, and love between man and woman, but also parental love. I mean, he absolutely doted on his son. Spoiled him rotten, I think, would be fair to say. And his he was he was devoted to his parents. So he felt family love was very strong. So he tries to turn these things that he valued so much around to the nastiest converse that he possibly can. So he's got this pedophile who ingratiates himself into the family and pretends as a kind of stepfather, but he's really, at one stage, he thinks of killing the woman he's married, but he doesn't have the nerve to go through it. But conveniently, she gets killed in an accident. And he plans to drug rape his stepdaughter, but the drugs don't work. But anyway, for those who haven't read Lolita, I'm not going to spoil too much of the story, but it's the creepiest kind of intensity of romantic love that Humbert, the narrator, is expressing for this 12-year-old. He's only, you called him middle-aged. Well, people do think of him that way, but he's only 38 and he's very handsome. And he's very vain too, so he's very conscious of his handsomeness. And he plays on that in order to kind of get Lolita infatuated, but then it goes far beyond anything that she could have imagined, and he imprisons her. I mean, something that I didn't mention is in his family background. His grandmother's sister was a major a psychologist, an anthropologist, and a criminologist. And she was very fascinated. Like, she wrote a book on women murderers. She was fascinated by extreme psychological types. And she was almost a de facto grandmother, because his real grandmother died when he was only 3. So he was very close to this woman, this Aunt Pasha, as they called her. He was very aware of the psychological literature on extreme sexual perversions or on criminal perversion. I mean, a lot of his characters are criminals, murderers, and so he often inverts his own values in the person of the narrator of one of his books. As he said in one of his interviews, all these characters are demons he's booted out of the cathedral. So they're gargoyles on the outside of the cathedral, if you like. So there was the fascination of doing something very, very difficult. That was another part of Lolita, getting inside the head of somebody who was so remote from him. This travesty of family love, both in terms of Humbert's relationship to the wife he pretends to love briefly, and the daughter whom he loves in an entirely wrong way. So he read a lot of psychological case studies to find out how things were, and it's really interesting that women who are sexual abuse therapists think Lolita is just fabulous. It's it offers such an insight into the workings of the mind of a perpetrator. They've written articles on Lolita as a tool for sexual abuse therapy.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
but I guess it kind of makes sense, because he portrays it from Humbert's perspective, and it's not just this caricature of, it's the kind of rich internal monologue, I guess, or whatever.
Yeah, the really creepy thing about it, of course, is because he's such a romantic, this character, even though he's a pervert, that his romanticism kind of sweeps the reader to some extent along with him, and you feel kind of tainted by your complicity in his desire. So it is a very uncomfortable read even now. I mean, unlike books that have been scandalous in the past, like Madame Bovary or Ulysses, it's actually at least as scandalous now as it was back then.
Yeah, there's this weird thing when, for me at least, when I've read it, when you go, like, this is really beautifully written, but by God, I've rarely seen like the topic a topic of that nature paired with often such great prose at the same time, and such, as you said, romanticism about the topic, and then you realize he's, going to a 12-year-old prostitute, if that's what you can call it. In the beginning, in particular, what I was thinking of at the Riviera, Côte d'Azur, I can't remember, somewhere in France. Yeah, it's definitely a weird kind of ambivalence you feel of these two conflicting emotions. Well, maybe more than two, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about Pale Fire, the novel that I don't know whether actually you've done this about any others, but you've written a book on Pale Fire, which seems like a bit of a meta joke. But so here's the thing. I started reading Pale Fire a few days ago. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to finish it before we started this, but I have to admit, I have no idea what to make of that book. It's so maybe for actually, do you want to? Yeah, I'm not going to introduce it. Why if you're there? Maybe what is Pale Fire? What kind of book is it? How should you think about it and approach it?
Well, it's a novel in the form of a 999-line poem by an American academic poet, and an introduction and a line-by-line commentary and an index to the commentary by his next-door neighbor, who's also an academic in this small American town. It's a bit like Cornell, if you like. The poet dies tragically just after completing, so this is a spoiler if you haven't got that far, dies after completing this poem, which is his magnum opus, really. And the neighbor, who's utterly insufferable, an absolute egomaniac, intrusive, and tries to, he's homosexual, and he's I mean, that's, I don't know, his relationship to the poet is it's not really sexual, because the poet is happily married and very heterosexual, but there's that complicates the relationship. And the commentator, the neighbor next door, who seems to, he's either in a department of Zemlin literature, and Zemlin may be a real country within the novel of the world, or the world of the novel, or he could be in a Russian department. It's a bit unclear. It shows through that he's probably, in fact, a mad Russian exile who's created this fantasy of Zembla. Or anyway, the commentary, which is supposed to be line by line, sometimes has excellent comments on poetic effects, but usually it pays no attention to this autobiographical poem and tells the story of Charles II, the last king of Zembla, who was exiled, who fled after a revolution. And it's very funny. It's kind of romantic, the story, the Zemlin story. It almost, to some people reading it, it makes the poem, which is so realistic, seem pale, because it's so fanciful. But it's a satire on academic self-presentation, the self-presentation of critics when they take over a work and don't allow much space for the original author. So it's partly that, although it's not that's a very thin version of what the things that are going on. It's really it's the fascination between this very homely poet who's writing wonderful poetry, but about a very prosaically experienced life, with this person writing the prose commentary to it, who's a madman and seems to be conjuring up all these visions. It's also what entranced me, what made me flip about it when I was 16, was that if you follow the cues, there are little bracketed comments saying, see note in the foreword, see note to line 691. And if you go to line 691, you start to find things out about the situation that you realize you shouldn't be knowing at this stage in the foreword. And then it's the note to line 691's got another cross reference to somewhere else. And you get about 4 or 5 of these, and you're losing fingers to keep your place in the various notes. But if you follow that circuit, you know practically all the surprises of the story long before you've sensed you should, and then you go back and you try and it's just what I think is so extraordinary about Nabokov as a writer is that he tries to to give the reader a sense of the excitement of discovery that he felt in dealing with nature as a lepidopterist. So he was just so thrilled, so compelled to carry on working at the microscope at Harvard when he was working as a semi-professional lepidopterist, and he just felt that the thrill of discovery was just incomparable. And so he's trying to supply that kind of a thrill in his literary work, especially his late literary work, and perhaps I think he does it more successfully. So I subtitled my book on Pale Fire, "The Magic of Artistic Discovery," which was a kind of nod to Karl Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery. You seemed surprised by the fact that I'd written a book about a novel. Well, I've done that. Had already done that. My PhD thesis was on Nabokov's Ada, which came out 7 years after Pale Fire, which is very, very complicated, very funny, very obscene, wild. A kind of steampunk novel almost, because it's set on an alternative Earth in the 19th century where there are swimming pools and cars and planes and so on. But I wrote my thesis on that, and it came out as a book. And I was going to transition from working on Nabokov after the biography came out to working on Shakespeare, and I thought I needed to get all my Nabokov material out of my study and get some space for Shakespeare and for other things I'd become interested in. And then I just looked at all my index card notes on Ada that I don't know, several thousand index cards. And I thought, I really should do something with this. I should publish it as line by line annotations, more or less. So like what the Mad Annotator does in Pale Fire. And I started publishing that serially, annotations to one chapter, and there are 69 chapters in the novel, every 6 months. And I'm still going. I'm at I've finished chapter 54, and this commentary to the novel is now about 2,200 pages long, and it's going to hit 3,000 before I'm finished. So I'm within sight of the end, but over 3/4 of the way through. But yeah, so if you thought one book about Pale Fire, a book, and so I've got a website on this which is interactive, where you can jump from a passage of the text to my annotations, to images, to motifs that.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to figure out like what the thought process is of someone who reads Pale Fire, with the whole basically making fun of the people making annotations of books and then deciding to do that yourself anyway. Kind of what did you? I mean, was there a point where you were like, is Nabokov saying you just shouldn't do this, or is it just kind of a playful? It's just a way to play with different genres. Like, what was your like? Was there a point where you're like, I think I shouldn't do this just because of Pale Fire?
Not at all. In fact, Nabokov got the very idea for the format of Pale Fire because he devoted quite a few years curiously enough, in the years while he was writing Lolita and teaching at Cornell and Harvard, he devoted several years of very intense work to his own annotations, to his own translation of the great Russian verse novel Eugene Onegin by Pushkin, and it came out in 4 volumes, and it's such an unparalleledly rich set of annotations that it's been translated into Russian and other languages that people have translated. Somebody translated Pale Fire, Eugene Onegin from his English version into Dutch without knowing any Russian, because his translation is so astonishingly exact and his annotations are so precise. So no, he respected he wanted to show what he could do as a literary scholar, having landed a job at Cornell, I think. But it wasn't that he felt that literary scholarship was ridiculous. It's just that it was often done very badly, egotistically.
Okay. I have a brief last question about Pale Fire. Just because with Pale Fire, there's, as you alluded to, kind of the question of in what order do you read it? So you said follow the cues. And I actually thought by that, for context for the listeners, we had to reschedule this and I said, oh great, I'll have a bit more time to read Pale Fire. And then you said follow the cues. And so I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I thought you meant follow somehow I didn't think of those cross references. What I did is I read the introduction, and then at the end of the introduction, I think he says, actually read my commentary first.
Yeah.
So actually I read the introduction and then the commentary and then the kind of poem as you go along with the commentary. So I'm just curious. I mean, this is a weird question to ask about a novel, but what order should I read it in?
Well, I think what I read it in, I followed those cross-reference cues, and then I think I got a sense of how unreliable a commentator Kinbote was, so I ignored his instruction to read his commentary before the poem and read the poem. I'm not sure. It's a long time ago now, but I think there's no. Obviously it's going to be a different experience whatever order you read things in that novel. But I think part of the fun of the novel is that the poem is so perfectly structured. It's got 999 lines. It's got a very powerful the line 500, the middle line of the poem is just a tragic conclusion to one part of the poet's life. And it's really heartrending. I mean, I've read it out to people in kitchens and in buses, and people have tears in their eyes. It's really very moving. But the commentary seems utterly crazy. You're trying to get back to the poem, and yet you want to hear more about this mad story of a king's escape and so on, imprisonment and escape, and just the weird customs of Zembla as the commentator describes it. So the perfect control of the poem and the utter chaos of the commentary, and yet Nabokov has also got about 4 different plot lines converging on the last 2 notes in the commentary, so that despite the apparent chaos, you're led along various threads, and it's an even more complex order underneath that chaos. So it's very satisfying.
Yeah. I mean, I just remember, especially the first page when I read it. It's this way because it's an introduction to this poem, and then you have this formal like, oh, he wrote it on this cards and he did this and that, and then at the end of one of those paragraphs, it just says like, "There's a loud amusement park outside my window," and you just go, "What? What? Like, is that supposed to be there?" Like, yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay, I wanted to ask a little bit about Nabokov's writing process. I mean, I don't know how much you can say about it, but kind of how did he write? Is there any advice that did you learn anything about how to write a book from him in terms of like how, like practically how to do it? How did he write all those novels?
Well, in his earlier work, his Russian work, he wrote longhand. He never learned to type, and he revised incredibly heavily. But partly, I think, because he was working as a lepidopterist in the 40s, he developed the habit of getting research notes on index cards, and he decided that was a good way to compose his novels. He would spend 3 or 6 months. He would get the basic idea of a novel in a kind of flash of inspiration, and then he would kind of try to figure out to resolve all the problems it might have in the telling, and a new way, a new angle of telling it. He would try to resolve all that before he set anything down on paper. And then by the time he started to write, he knew the novel that he wanted to write so well that he could start anywhere in the book. And so he would pick up an index card for a late chapter and write a few paragraphs, and then flip a couple of 100 pages earlier, and so on. Do it in whatever order that came to him on a particular day. He would write in pencil, and he had a pencil with a a rubber eraser on the back, and he was very proud of using up his eraser faster than the lead and the pencil. He revised so meticulously and so obsessively. So, it's a very unusual process of composition, and of course, not one that anybody who's got a computer nowadays is going to use.
I was a little bit surprised that he had that process because, he's such a poetic writer. I would have almost assumed more that he, wrote and let the language itself carry it forward to some extent, as, other authors do. But in a way, it's, I guess, also very, very fitting for someone who composed chess problems in his teenage years, that he would go the complete opposite way and basically figure out what he was going to say and then kind of add the words almost.
There are always hidden trapdoors in Nabokov's fiction, I think. So, and you fall through them and you discover a new world underneath, and then you fall through to another level, and that's part of the fun. And part of especially for his late fiction works like Lolita and Pale Fire and Ada, he's got to plant all these cues, these kind of almost, he does in his autobiography, he compares the process of writing to the composition of chess problems. And clearly it's a kind of cue to readers to read his novels in that way. So, yeah, and that's why I can, spend nearly 3,000 pages on annotating a 600-page novel. He's planted so many clues, even on the first line or two. It took about several pages to disentangle what he was doing there. And yet, on the other hand, he also makes sure that his language is very accessible. It's not difficult in the way that, say, late Joyce is. It's not easy reading, of course, but his sentences flow so fast, they carry you along, even though you realize that you're not getting everything as you go. You'll have to come back, or you have to make connections. But on the surface, it seems very lucid. It is lucid.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that I find sometimes a little bit difficult is that I think he has, I feel like you have to pay very close attention because he uses so much visual imagery and details and that kind of stuff that I typically don't like that too much, actually. I think I prefer authors with very plain writing styles. Because I always have to, with Nabokov, I have to concentrate on actually imagining it. Otherwise, I feel like it just loses a lot.
Well, yes, he writes in a way that very deliberately targets the visual imagination of the reader, and the whole sensory imagination of the reader, but especially the visual. Yeah, he does want readers to imagine.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit about, in a sense, the perception of Nabokov. So, I mean, the one kind of, as we briefly discussed before we started recording, I feel like he's one of those kind of famous, non-famous writers where his name is very famous, and in a way he is, but somehow I think many people, he's not, as widely read, maybe, that's the way of putting it, as other people, outside of Lolita, maybe. So maybe, with a very trite kind of question is almost like, should he have won the Nobel Prize? He never did. He was nominated once, I believe, in one of the probably strongest years of nominations. If you look who else was nominated, W.H. Auden, Samuel Beckett, Borges, Neruda, and E.M. Forster. None of whom won it. It went to Mikhail Sholokhov, however you pronounce that. How do you feel about that? Should he have won it?
Well, the Nobel Prize is a hit and miss thing, and a lot of people felt in the 60s that it clearly should have gone to Nabokov. Norman Mailer was told he'd won it, and so I don't know how that happened, but he said, "God, what about Nabokov?" That was his immediate reaction. Of course, he wasn't anywhere near deserving a Nobel Prize, but I think the Nobel Prize often rewards great writers and often selects people who will not actually last the distance. And I think a better measure for me is writers. Writers select the canon of future generations of readers, I think, and their enthusiasms. There are so many writers who've been inspired by Nabokov. And Martin Amis is one, of course. Martin Amis has this lovely comment about Nabokov. He does all the usual things in fiction better than everybody else. So he's talking about plot, characterization, language, form. And I think that's true, that I think he loosened up the way fiction could be written. So a lot of people are profiting from his discoveries, as he profited from discoveries that were made by, say, Tolstoy and Joyce and Proust and Gogol.
We've talked now for, I don't know, 1.5 hours or whatever about Nabokov. I want to ask about you a little bit. So it sounds very critical, but it's more out of curiosity. How exactly does one get to spend years, if not decades, of one's life researching a single person and writing books about that person? I mean, so you mentioned earlier a little bit how you first read Nabokov. So maybe when did this kind of interest in reading someone of yours become a bit more serious, and where you mentioned your PhD thesis? I don't know whether there was anything before that, but well, presumably you don't just randomly choose that topic, I guess. How did your kind of more serious involvement with Nabokov start, and when did you kind of go like, I'm actually going to write a biography about him now?
Well, as I said, in my last year at high school, I flipped over Pale Fire and I read that very, very thoroughly. I actually wrote an article on Pale Fire in my first year at university. There was an essay in American Studies where we could choose whatever topic, and I asked, can I write in Pale Fire? And they were very excited to have somebody write on such a new novel, a complicated novel that wasn't on the course. So I was allowed to do that, and I turned that into an article for publication. It didn't get accepted, but I did my MA thesis on him and thought that was Nabokov out of my system. And I went to Toronto to do my PhD, so we had 2 years of coursework before we got into our thesis. I was actually going to do a 17th century topic first, was what I put for my scholarship application. I got back into the 20th century, and I was going to work on the American novelist John Barth, whom I'd got very interested in. But I started working on him for about 6 months, and I got a bit bored. And something, a visit to a friend of my mother's, there was a picture on the wall, alerted me to a clue that I'd missed in the opening page of Ada, which I'd written. One of the books I'd written about in my MA thesis, and I thought, God, I've missed so much. And so I just I went back to Ada and started going through following up cues in the reference library of the Toronto University, and I was just making so many discoveries every day, and it was just bliss the whole 2.5 years I was working on the thesis. And then I wanted to carry on working on Nabokov. The terms of my scholarship obliged me to come back to New Zealand from Canada, and I resented this fiercely. And at this stage, I had a Canadian girlfriend, and I thought, I was going to be so far away from research materials, I knew there wouldn't be much on Nabokov in New Zealand. Nabokov was kind of famous for saying that he didn't think people should study literary manuscripts. He said that reading a writer's manuscripts was like, a writer making manuscripts available was like passing around samples of your own sputum. And so he gave the impression that he'd destroyed all his manuscripts. But in the year I finished the thesis, Letters Between Nabokov and the literary critic Edmund Wilson came out, and I went to Yale University Library to find the originals and discovered 25 letters that hadn't been incorporated, and lots of mistakes in the published version. So I started scouring around libraries in the northeast of the US and finding lots of things. And I was thinking at that stage of doing a bibliography of Nabokov. There had been one done, but it was absolutely full of errors and of no use to anybody. So I thought of doing a bibliography that would, and there'd also been a biography done that was by the same person. It was even more erroneous. And I thought of smuggling in a biography by the back door by setting out the context in which he wrote and every major work and his relationships with his publishers and so on. And so I had I'd done a lot of kind of biobibliographical work, and then I sent my first 2 chapters of my thesis to somebody in the US who was a Russian literary scholar who was republishing Nabokov's works in Russian in the US, and also edited something called Russian Literature Tri-Quarterly. He sent it on to Nabokov's widow, and she invited me to visit her. And so instead of coming back across the Pacific, I went back across Europe and met her in Switzerland. And because of all this work I'd been doing in archives in the US, I knew a lot of things about Nabokov that weren't common knowledge, and I was grilling her. And then a couple of months after, I got back to New Zealand to do a postdoc on New Zealand literature, which I'd never really encountered. I'd not paid much attention to it at all at university or subsequently. She wrote to me asking, would I sort out Nabokov's archive for her? And so she paid my way, she paid my time, and I was able to look through this enormous archive, catalogue it for her, and kept on asking her questions. Eventually she said to me, I wanted to see his letters to his parents, which I knew were there. She wouldn't let me see them. And she said, why do you need to see those? If you were writing a biography, of course, I would show you everything. But if you're doing only a bibliography. And so my jaw dropped. But so I reminded her of that a bit. So I was just starting university teaching, picking up a lot of new material. I got a scholarship to do the bibliography and reminded her of what she'd said and said, would you tolerate my doing a biography? So that's how it started.
What was it like meeting Vera Nabokov for the first time? Because, I mean, she's so present in, I don't know whether all novels are dedicated to her, but many of them are dedicated to her.
Yes,
from his autobiography. What was it like meeting her for the first time, and what was she like?
Pretty daunting. She's very severe, and she has a good sense of humor, but I wasn't able to trigger it very well, unlike Nabokov, who is a naturally very, very funny person. She was quite deaf. She was 77 when I first met her. She was quite deaf, so conversation was very strained. She couldn't interpret my New Zealand accent very well. I don't know what it was. And I was always trying to pry out of her more information than she was willing to give. So it was fraught in that way. So she trusted me enough to allow me to work in the archive, to lock it up, to come back and start working any time I liked while I was there for a year and a half. But she didn't drop her guard until she read the first chapter of the biography. And then she'd always call me Mr. Boyd until then. And then suddenly it was Dear Brian, so she'd been apprehensive, I guess, about what I would write. So you raised the question about somebody dedicating himself to working on one author. Well, I've published far more on Nabokov than anybody else has, and than most people do on one author. But there are many literary scholars who will work on one author their whole career. I've written a book that covers Homer and Dr. Seuss and the history of storytelling from prehistoric times to the present. I've published a couple of books on Shakespeare, and I'm going to have another one up my sleeve. And I'm currently writing a biography of Karl Popper, who has nothing to do with literature. So I do lots of other things as well, even as well as being compulsive about Nabokov.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't mean it in the sense of like,
no.
Not having other interests. What I mean is more like, I guess in part, what you just described is that it's not like you decided to do this and then you spent however many years on it. It kind of developed gradually and back and forth, and sometimes more, sometimes less. But I guess there's something, in science, I'm used to talking to people who spend, decades trying to figure out a very specific question. But somehow that seems to me categorically different from saying like, I want to understand this person and their work. It's in a way quite different, even though, you know, the time spent and the work is probably more or less the same, I would imagine. But yeah, it's just curious to me. Like, I like reading biographies, but I imagine, like, it must, you know, I mean, you have two, like, 800 or 900 page books on it, on him. So how do you write? Oh, how does one? But in particular, how did you write this book? I mean, did you already mentioned smuggling a poem out of the Soviet Union? I wonder whether that has something to do with it. But what's the kind of practical work of writing a biography about someone who died, but pretty recently?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, because I had access to his archives, I knew the people he was in closest contact with. And if they were still alive, I went and interviewed them. And in fact, Vera gave me the addresses of the people she wanted me to see most. But I did work in, I think, 18 countries for the biography. So, yeah, it was a lot when I was just coming out of having been a student for 10 years. It was an expensive business. His archive was very large, and I was the only person who had access to it too. So there was also, he'd given a lot of papers to the Library of Congress as a tax break in the wake of the success of Lolita. And that material was not publicly available at all. So I was the first person to get access to that material. And so I had access to a lot of unknown Nabokov, as well as to all his living friends. And there was also a surprising amount of, say, in Columbia University in New York, there's a very good emigre literary archive. So a lot of his friends are represented there, in his own letters to people in the Russian literary community in the 20s and 30s was there. So I was able to build up a pretty comprehensive picture of him. Now I'm working on Popper, Karl Popper, who didn't die until he was 92 and was absolutely a workaholic. I mean, he would work through the night in his 80s and 90s. He's got an archive that seems about 10 times the size of Nabokov's, and also had contacts with Nabokov as a writer was working on his own, just him and the index cards or him and the blank page, whereas Popper as a philosopher and as a philosopher of science was always talking to other philosophers or to scientists, and so there's this vast network of people with whom he's working out ideas, and so the data is just endless. So it's a very different process. Thank goodness I've got, I'm working with computers now. When I was writing the Nabokov biography, PCs were just coming in, and I had a very shaky one. The only thing I could afford, which was not a high end thing. This was long before Apple or anything like that, and my computer was so temperamental that I didn't know if it was going to boot properly that day when I switched it on. And in fact, I lost most of the material of volume 1 after having written it. I mean, I had printouts of it all. My wife and another friend had to re-enter it in a new computer. But in those days, I was writing longhand, and I did use index cards. In fact, Nabokov composed in index cards. Well, I took up that idea from him, but I had thin paper cut to index card size so that I could take, say, 10,000 cards in a briefcase between Malta, Switzerland, and Auckland, so that I'd never let them out of my grasp, really. And yes, then I was writing longhand and entering into a computer. But now, of course, I do everything on computer, and I can access Popper's archive online. So many things have changed.
Yeah. It seems like you didn't with Nabokov and Popper, you didn't exactly choose the easiest people to write about. Yeah, you could have chosen someone who wrote 2 books or 3 books or something like that. But I guess you chose very prolific people.
Yeah, prolific, and also I think both of them were hailed very highly in their time, but are also not appreciated at what I think is their worth. So yeah, I mean, there are aspects of Nabokov that were not really understood. His philosophical depth, I think, wasn't appreciated in his lifetime. So that was one of my key focuses, and in my PhD thesis, and that was something that appealed very much to Vera Nabokov, because nobody had really tackled that side of his work before.
I'm curious a little bit about, in a sense, the responsibility of writing a biography. Anyone who likes Nabokov and wants to know about him as a person beyond what you can read on Wikipedia, basically, has to buy a book. So kind of Nabokov's life goes through you, like via your interpretation of it and how you write about it, how you think about it. Is that something that was that you felt whilst writing it, feeling like, here's this person whose writing means a lot to me, and I've met all his friends and family, and I want to do well by them? And yeah, I'm just curious a little bit about kind of whether you felt any like pressure or responsibility when writing this kind of book, or whether it's like, if it doesn't work, someone else will write a better one.
Well, I mean, I think I try to be a responsible writer in everything I do, but there certainly is a strong sense that everything that you choose to focus on and every sentence of the way you describe it is coloring the reader's take on this. And you could skew it so many different ways. You could change the emphasis, change the tone, change the selection of the details, and it would be quite a different picture. So I had to just trust my sense of what I thought was important about his character, about his creative imagination, about his relationships with others. And yeah, it's a very responsible kind of position. And in the case of Popper, I think I'm feeling it perhaps even more acutely because Popper was Nabokov's works puzzled many people or mystified some and so on. But he was such a very private person that although he had some good friends, very few people knew him beyond the persona he presented in the many interviews that were published during his lifetime. Whereas Popper was not a self-contained person in the way Nabokov was, and he was also so full of contradictions and intensities that he really antagonized so many people, and he had so many devotees, and try and work out what it was about his personality that caused some people to think he was a monster and other people to think he was divine. So, it's. I think actually psychologically the Popper biography will be much more complicated than Nabokov, because even though Nabokov deals with characters who are psychologically complex and sees them from the inside, he was kind of very straightforward, despite the fact that he wrote about some very perverted people. Whereas Popper was mysterious to himself in a way. I mean, he was a critical rationalist, but he would fly into temper tantrums and alienate people by the intensity of his criticism of them and by his wanting to convert them by just being so unrelenting in an argument that they'd be often was arguing in circles around them. So, they felt the vulnerability of their position, and yet he was wanting to drive home, almost, as some people have said, almost seemed to be wanting them to write a note of submission to his arguments. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to the Popper biography, but from what I understand, it's still going to be a bit until that comes out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so people can put it on their radar, but
yeah.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask. You already answered a little bit, but like, what Nabokov book should people start with?
As I said, I think The Defense is perhaps the most humanly engaging in a positive way. The hero in that is he's also psychologically twisted in certain ways, but in a very endearing and helpless kind of way. And his relationship with his wife, who takes him on as a kind of psychological problem child, is so touching. It's very tragic, but it's marvelously warm. And Pnine is a novel that many respond to immediately. It's got a very appealing central character, and in some ways it's very funny, but it's also very sad. So that would be one that many people find congenial. My own personal recommendation, well, I think his autobiography, Speak Memory, is just, in terms of its prose, is actually better than almost his fiction. I mean, his fiction, he's creating masks through which he speaks, and those masks are fascinating. But he's not well. I mean, there is a kind of mask, I suppose, in Speak Memory, but the prose is less mannered and just more beautiful than in most of his fiction, and I think it's so evocative. Pale Fire is, as I've said, my own personal favourite, although I've written more on Ada. Ada is very funny, very raunchy, very crazy, very overloaded, but it is just inexhaustible. So if you're ready to come back, well, I mean, the thing with Nabokov's fiction is that even though they can become very complicated if you follow up all the cues and clues and try to solve the riddles. If you don't feel you have to do that, you can enjoy it on the surface level. And Ada is just full of a very passionate love affair, very, very erotic, much more so than Lolita, and full of a strange kind of passionate intensity and just vividness. Anyway. So, I mean, it's hard for me to narrow it down to a few books, as you can tell.
Yeah. At the end of each interview, I have 3 current questions I ask each guest. The first is, what's a book or paper more people should read? This can be old, new, famous, not known at all. Just something you think more people should read.
So my recommendation, if you ask me that question, would be a Brazilian novelist, Joaquim Machado de Assis, who was born in Brazil in 1837, I think. He was mulatto, so his grandfather was a slave, his father was a freedman, but slavery wasn't abolished in Brazil until, I think it was 1881, so when he was nearing his 50s. And in 1881, he published what I think is just an outstanding book, the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, which is like a combination of Samuel Beckett and Nabokov. It's just an extraordinary novel in terms of the 19th century. It's just so self-conscious and so funny, so black, is in mood, psychologically very, very dark, and yet, it's just exquisitely written and full of surprises, and very, very funny. So that would be my pick. And people who have read Machado, he was just adored by everybody in Brazil who reads anything. He is regarded with a reverence that Russians have for Pushkin and greater than English speakers have for Shakespeare. He's just popular amongst all ages who read there. And anybody from outside Brazil who reads him is blown away. But he's up there with Flaubert and Tolstoy and so on, and Dickens, but he's not read at the same level. And so, yeah, that would be my pitch.
Okay, it's a fantastic recommendation because I've never heard of him. I've said this before, like usually these recommendations are something I've never heard of before or something that I've heard about 500 times and I know I should read. Occasionally I've actually read things, but almost never. So I love always the ones that also come from I probably prefer the ones that I've never heard of, like this one. Is there a particular translation you'd recommend, or is there just one? Or
there are 2 newish translations that came out in about the last 2 or 3 years into English. I used to teach it within the context of an English course, and I retranslated if you know a bit of Latin and a bit of French, and I don't know, and you're interested enough, I translated the opening paragraph or so of his text into exactly the same number of words that he had used. So 100 words, 100 words, and whereas the 2 existing translations that were available at that time were about 130 or 150 words, and they'd lost all the tautness and the rhythm. And so I certainly couldn't do that for the whole novel. But I gather that these two new versions, which I haven't read, are much superior to the earlier version. So there's a 2020 something. There's one with notes and one without notes, and apparently the one with notes is very useful because it's a very elusive novel, but the one without notes is actually probably the more idiomatic translation into English. But I mean, I don't know how he's been translated into German if you want to read him that way.
Yeah, I always have this question, like, do I read the English or German translation? I guess Portuguese probably doesn't make that much of a difference. Like, there's some language where there's an obvious, like...
Yeah, well, I guess it's been translated more often probably into English, so you've got a range of translations there.
Yeah, anyway, I'll find the two you mentioned and put them in the show notes. Second question is something you wish you'd learned sooner, which can be, from your work life, from your private life, whatever you want, but something that you think would have improved your life if you'd learned it a little bit sooner.
Well, where do I start? I picked up German to do the Popper biography. I wish I'd known, picked it up, in a very rudimentary kind of way. I wish I'd learned that early. I wish I'd learned Greek, which he works with, as well as quantum mechanics. I wish I'd learned a lot of physics. I wish I'd learned a lot of philosophy. So, I mean, Popper is like Nabokov is a polymath in perhaps even more directions than Nabokov. So I'm pushing beyond the boundaries of my secure knowledge everywhere I tread in the Popper biography. So, yeah, there are all sorts of things I wish I knew. And I was hoping, in a way, that doing the Popper biography would be a kind of way of picking up a second education. But, it hasn't worked out that way. Just compiling the data and assembling it and so on. I never expected to get up to his level of mastery of quantum physics, where he talked to Schrödinger and Einstein and Bohr and argued with them and others, and was one of the founding editors of the foundations of physics and logic. I mean, he did groundbreaking work in logic. All these fields that are, I thought I was going to get up to a certain level of competence. I'm not going to be able to do that, and I think I have interesting things to say about his ideas all the same, and I certainly know his life better than anybody else. I think, I've just been working with the data so much, I've got far more data, but yeah, all those things, if I'd had German and Greek, physics. Oh, yes, it would have been so much easier. But, the thing is that nobody who would consider undertaking Popper's biography would have all those skills. So that's my consolation.
Yeah.
And he also wrote music in a Bach-like vein, and he studied at the Vienna Conservatory of Music, and I listen to a lot of classical music, but I have no sophisticated understanding in the way he had, and he would whistle symphonies for pleasure.
Yeah. I guess that's the tricky part of. I guess in that way, maybe doing these interviews is a little bit similar to writing a biography, in the sense that you try and enter someone's world and the way they think and that kind of stuff, and you're always a complete outsider to everything because they've lived it, and with a biography, obviously, you can spend a lot more time on it than I can with an interview. But there's the sense of, especially with you today, we just talked about Nabokov, but there were so many other things that we could have talked about, and that, I guess I have the luxury in that sense that I can just focus on one topic and spend less time on it overall. But yeah, I understand what you mean. I've definitely had some interviews where you're like, how do I understand all of this and be able to hold a decent interview with this person who knows like a million things more about a million different topics. But I guess, I don't know, maybe a biography is in the sense like an interview then, where you're the intermediary between the person and someone who knows almost nothing about it. I don't know. Final question, advice for PhD students or postdocs. So yeah, usually I ask this to, people in neuroscience and psychology, where I guess there's a kind of more traditional, or where there's a specific meaning to that context. I don't know whether that's the same in like, writing biographies and I guess the question is always about like people at this kind of transitionary period. But, you finish something, you're starting to become independent, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. My stress would be on going for quality over quantity. The pressure is so much to build up a CV with lots and lots of publications. But unless you're really developing an original line of inquiry, just a sheer number of publications, I think, are not going to get you very far. So I think I would suggest, slowing down the publication rate and making sure that you've got a problem that nobody else has been quite asking in the same way, or perhaps an entirely new problem. That would be my advice.
Okay. Well, yeah, as I said,
easier said than done, of course.
Yeah.
Find an original problem.
Yeah.
I think if people can see that you're asking something new, you're not just using an existing methodology that happens to be productive at the moment, then they'll be more likely to want to single you out for support.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, Brian, thank you very much for your time. As I said in the beginning, this is kind of an unusual episode for me. That was very special. Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time, and looking forward to the Popper biography.
Yes, me too. Thanks very much, Ben. It was a pleasure talking to you.